Our final speaker in this session is Ros Harvey. So Ros comes at these issues from a much more entrepreneurial perspective. She's the founder and managing director of the Yield Technology Solutions, and I'm sure you'll find her presentation interesting. Thanks, Ros.
Thanks, Mick, and it's terrific to be here with such an amazing audience. I feel a bit intimidated by you all because I know there's so much expertise in the audience. And I want to congratulate AFI for bringing this event together, because I just think it's such an incredibly important topic and a great report that you guys have released, which I read from cover to cover. So look, I've been asked to speak about the future of ag tech and the implications. I'm going to give this my implications particularly for Australia. So I'm going to give you this my best shot, understanding that it's notoriously difficult to predict anything, but particularly the future. So if you look at... Oh, we haven't got... I know what the problem is. Try that. Can we see now? Alrighty. You don't want to see my slide thing.
So how did you get that?
Let's do it like this again. We're right now. Perfect. Thank you very much. Technology, it doesn't always work. This is what drives crows crazy. The experience never lives up to the promise. So anyway, what we're actually looking at in terms of digital ag initiatives is really on farm. There's probably three things at the heart of the business problems that people are trying to solve. One of them's uncertainty, knowing when and how much and what to do, like when to plant, when to harvest, when to feed, when to irrigate. There's a set of problems around labour shortage and labour cost, which particularly robotics are very well positioned to help us address. And then there's a set of issues around information asymmetries. Some folks know some things and not others. Classic things around this is knowing what does the consumer want? What am I going to get best return on farm? So there's these three broad categories. But look, for the sake of today, given the time constraints, I just want to focus on the first one of these, which is uncertainty. And really, the Yield is a business that is focusing, our business challenge that we deal with is uncertainty. And I'll come back to that later in the presentation. The fundamental uncertainty that growers deal with is the weather. And this uncertainty and risk just runs through the whole food supply chain, because decisions that are made on farm ricochet through the food supply chain all the way through to things like processing, shelf life, logistics. All of these things are connected. So in terms of looking at the future, if you're trying to think about the future, a good place to start is often thinking about the past. So when we think about this risk of weather, it's not so long ago that our grandparents made decisions based on a doggerel. In this case, red sky in the morning, shepherd's warning, red sky at night, shepherd's delight. This was a way of dealing with uncertainty. And there's some science behind it in terms of looking at weather and how understanding what's happening. Now, every grower is using weather apps and technology, and they've got apps on their phones. They've got weather stations. Some have weather stations on their property. Some have sensors. So we've already made an enormous leap from where we were, just in terms of a few generations ago. But if we're really going to look to the future, we need to really understand that it is in many ways already here. And you may well have heard the saying of the American novelist William Gibson that the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. And the challenge before us is to really think about how do we distribute that future more evenly. And if we look at particularly in the league tables of best performers in digitisation, it's really, really clear, you can see it. At the very top of the table is industries like ICT, obviously, but the financial markets. At the very, very bottom is food and ag. We have the lowest levels of digitisation than any industry in the world. And so I think if we're going to look at the future, it's worthwhile looking at one of the performers that are right at the top, the financial markets. And this is what in the financial markets used to look like, again, not so long ago, less than 100 years ago, where people were on the trading floors using tickets, they had not enough information, there's an enormous amount of uncertainty and risk. And this is what financial markets look like today. Effectively, what we have is linked together with information at their fingertips coming from multiple sources all around the world, with algorithms trolling it to help make decisions, and in some case already automating it. What isn't well known is that an Australian business, in fact owned by all of Australia and New Zealand's universities, played a huge role in this digital transformation, living proof that we can create world-leading digital technology here in Australia. So early in the 2000s, Circa, originally funded by a grant from government, created the world's largest financial database. Today, it ingests something like 2 million transactions a second from every stock exchange in the world, every news story, every weather event. It pulls this data and it seamlessly serves it up to the world's financial markets with a corporate partner, Thomson Reuters. And this data feed is used by people to actually create, from the financial markets to actually do algo trading. It's used by regulators to keep those honest, and it's actually provided as a data feed to researchers to help create new knowledge. So effectively what we did here in Australia is create a phenomenally successful fintech business which has been financially independent for at least 10 years. And in the process, Circa actually created numerous spin-outs and startups, the ecosystem, the capital market CRC, all in all about $1 billion in value and about 1,000 highly skilled jobs and tens and thousands of publication citations. And in fact, Mike, the founder of Circa, is here today in the audience and is a bit of a partner in crime in this, because really what we want to be able to do is take some of that technology and understanding about shared knowledge infrastructure and take it into agricultural markets. So, Mike, I don't know if you want to just stand up there, just so people know where you are and might be able to catch up with you later. We're going to come back to Mike a little bit later, because some of the work that we're involved in is how do we take the learnings of those of the financial markets into the ag sector. So what does the future look like for ag tech? It looks like this. This actually is a photo from MIT Open Ag Initiative. And ultimately what's happening here in this initiative is there's a closed environment and they're solving the problem of uncertainty. Every plant within this lab has its own internet address. Scientists can measure precisely on every single plant how much water, what are the nutrients, its CO2, how much light it's getting, and then they use videos to monitor its growth and even how it tastes. And what's happening with this lab is they're creating digital recipes which they can share around the world. And effectively what they're doing is actually understanding the model at the level of the plant. Now, I don't think for a minute that this is around the corner or is how we are going to feed the world in the next 50 years. But it gives us a sense of the trajectory, because what's happening more and more with technological revolution is that we're able to gather information and data at a very fine level to help us reduce uncertainty and get more and more precise models so we can make better and better decisions on farm. So what are the implications for Australia? And so here goes the scary bit on what I think is coming, is that essentially we're going to have labour replaced by robots. I think we're going to have a much stronger connection of consumers linked to producers. We're going to have a smaller footprint as we improve our productivity, which is probably a good thing environmentally. We're going to have new capital flows, because as we reduce risk, what also happens is it's a condition for capital to actually invest. And so this in itself will create a feedback loop which will drive greater productivity. In the future, growers are going to be knowledge workers, like has happened in many, many other industries. And I think we're going to have polarised size of farms. We're going to have massive, huge farms, like we see in the Midwest of the States, where we're driving out high volumes of product. But I also think technology is going to allow small farms that actually can produce for niche markets and use technology to capture, to be able to make that a financial viable proposition, particularly if it's linked to a provenance story and being able to directly link to customers. And the final one is actually the one that I think is the challenge before us. And that is, are we going to have data markets or are we going to have data monopolies? And it's this issue that I really want to focus on in the second part of what I'm going to talk about, because I think it's the issue that is going to determine whether we can create a thriving ag-tech ecosystem in Australia or whether we're just going to be an outpost from a multinational that may well be based somewhere else. So what's really important about technology is that it is not neutral. It is socially determined. We get to decide. And so what we really need to be able to do is say, what sort of knowledge infrastructure do we want to underpin this incredible revolution that's happening? And I think the principles we need are sustainable and scalable and open innovation systems. And what's really important is that to understand that open is not free. And I think both the speakers before really made this point. We have to get a business model that underpins this to create a shared knowledge infrastructure that has to be financially sustainable. And we can't just rely on government funding to say for the ongoing operational costs. I do think government has a very important role, normally as creating, where there's market failure, creating imperative, getting going, just like they did in the case of Circa. But you need to have a plan to actually get to a sustainable financial model and that there's an exit strategy, otherwise you cannot create scalable systems. Now the reason I raise this issue is it really has very fundamental implications for who owns data and how we share the rewards of its use. And I want to be really quite clear, I 100% support the proposition that growers should own and control their own data. But they should also be able to share in the upside when we create value from that data. But how we implement that principle of grower control of data is really fundamental to whether we're going to create a dynamic ag-tech ecosystem or end up dependent on data monopolies. And so to explain what I mean about this and why I think this is so incredibly important, the whole second half of my presentation is going to focus on the example of the yield of how we sought to solve this very fundamental problem in the real world. And so let me just change gear, if you like, from the high-level vision stuff down to the nitty-gritty practical reality of what does this take to deliver on the ground. So Mike, who you met, and I, along with others, created the yield at about the same time as we created the Knowledge Economy Institute in 2015. And we called the yield for a reason. Because if you cannot affect this in agriculture, you fundamentally don't have a business. And so really technology has to come second. You have to really be able to focus on what is the business problem and how you're going to use technology to solve that. And I also want to be really clear that we see ourselves creating a global business from Australia. And that's why we've partnered with some of the world's biggest technology giants, that there are technology partners, but there also are scale partners. And in the case of Bosch, it's also a principal investor. We've just closed a capital raising round, and they've invested $3 million into the business, and we are their first global ag-tech investment. So you might ask why? A pretty small startup from Tasmania, what the hell's going on here? And I think the reason is that Australia is in fact the perfect testbed for actually developing this sort of technology. We are enormously innovative in ag. We have to be. Our production costs are high. We've got an open economy with less than 0.03% in subsidy. It pales into nothingness compared to what's happening in the States and Europe. We're an island. We've got to get our products out. We've got to import supplies. We've got the highest labour cost of the OECD. And we're the driest continent in the world. And we're facing the impact of climate change, losing arable land, and all the things that the rest of the world is going to experience in buckets we're experiencing right now. And so what that means is our growers are innovative because they absolutely have to be to survive. And that's what a business like mine needs. It needs partners that can help adopt, drive, help co-create the technology. So our recent capital raising round was to develop a microclimate sensing system. to address that fundamental problem of uncertainty, which is driven by weather, and it's certainly driven by understanding right down potentially to the plant level about what's happening. So to put this all back into perspective, I want to go back to oysters. So we started in our business in the oyster industry as an entree, in both senses of the words. Oysters are a great entree to a meal, and they're a great entree to an ag-tech business. Because what they let us do is prove the business model, the market, the technology, show execution, how do you achieve a return on investment. But we use platform technology throughout and then look to rapidly pivot into agriculture. So, true to our word, all our solutions are co-created with growers, and in this case the grower is Justin Gock, who's in Barilla Bay in Tasmania. And the problems, Justin identified a whole series of problems that he wanted to resolve, but the biggest one which we decided to focus on was the issue of unnecessary closures, of harvest closures. So oysters are like the premium product. They're fresh, live, eaten raw, and have a very high value in terms of the market. But the problem is that they're also quite dangerous for those very same reasons. So when it rains and you get runoff from the soil, they accumulate contaminants and they're dangerous to eat. So the regulator shuts them down for harvesting. The problem is that the regulator is dealing with the problem of uncertainty. What they do is use rainfall as a proxy, and they use rainfall from the nearest bomb weather station, which could be 100 kilometres away. So what we do is put a real-time salinity sensor into the water that the oyster is drinking, and we use that to actually measure and find a level of proxy for the risk of runoff. We get a 30% reduction in unnecessary closures just by doing that. We then can use data analytics to be able to predict the local from the wide area network data. So what that means is Justin not only is only shut when he needs to be, but he knows he's going to be shut, can get his product out of the water and get it to market. Justin loses between $20,000 and $100,000 a day that he is closed. And this problem, he gets closed 55 days a year, and this problem ricochets through the industry. So there's a very, very clear value proposition, which meant that we can demonstrate how to actually make this sort of new technology work. So coming to some of the points I think the other speakers also made, which is incredibly important, is this whole issue about how do we create a digital experience that is really reliable, trusted, and focusing on the business problem. So what we do as a business is provide an end-to-end stack. So what that means, we do the sensors, the platform, the data analytics, the user interface. All of that is done as a service. If it doesn't work, we don't get paid. Very good motivator. And effectively what you want that to do is to disappear and to focus on the actual decision that you're trying to support someone to make, in this case oyster growers. And so effectively we distill that all into very simple apps like traffic lights that show you risk of when you're going to at risk of getting closed, when you're going to be reopened, and it just is very simple, but growers can drill down into the data if they want to see it. I really like Dennis's point about quality, because I think this is incredibly important. There's a lot of arm waving in IoT. We just build a platform and we aggregate in data and whoop, off we go and do data analytics. This is really fundamentally the most important thing to understand, is that IoT, just like everything else, is governed by the GIGO principle. Garbage in, garbage out. What you have here is an example of two different sensors that are used in aquaculture. One, you can see there, I don't want to go into great detail, but just see the one that's diving down on the left-hand side. That's showing sensor drift. So within 10 days, it is basically virtually useless if it's not cleaned, because it gets biofoul and the reading is corrupted. On the second sensor is the one that we use, which is highly accurate. It's got a different scale even there, and you can see that it stays perfectly in line. It's a different technology, and it gives you a different degree of reliability. So if you don't know the quality of what you're federating into the platform, if you're not controlling the interface between the physical and the virtual world, particularly in environmental sensing, you really can just be having garbage. And if you have garbage, you can't do data analytics, and even if you do it, it's going to be wrong. So it's really important to understand this risk. So the interesting thing about the yield and what we're really doing is creating a business model of how do you create value out of shared data. Now, true to Dennis's words, I've got my own cloud there in the middle, but actually what we're doing is integrating data in from many different areas, and we've got 3 very different use cases. One is the oyster growers, who we sell as a service. The second is government, who uses the same data to actually regulate the opening and closing. And the third are researchers, where we provide the data directly to them, high quality data, so that we can accelerate research outcomes. Now, we do that free in return for taking the algorithms and commercialising them back into the system. And I actually like to think of this as a flower, because I think you could add many petals, and we're already having those sort of discussions with people further up the supply chain, like retailers who want to know what's going on, with banks, with insurers who are managing risk. All of these people can actually create value and get value from the data. So this really is an incredibly important issue to understand, because if we confuse the issue of open and free data and we pursue a policy decision that says that growers have their data and they should port it off into other clouds, the issue is that companies like mine would stop innovating, because the value is created at the top. It's in the flower, it's not in the stem. The stem is the way that you get the data, but the value is created in the analytics and in the user interfaces and in the solutions we sell to growers. So for me, the issue is not that we should be demanding control and to be able to put data all into common clouds, but that we should give growers transparency, control and incentive to share. And we've spent an awful lot of time thinking about this problem, and tomorrow Peter Leonard's going to be speaking with you about privacy and data sharing. And Peter's actually an investor in the business and manages all our customer contracts. So to actually go back to the principle of how do we give growers control, transparency and incentive to share, you have to structure that into your contracts, you have to structure it into your business model, you have to structure it into your data structures, to your technology. All of these things have to be aligned to make this possible. And so our contracts give growers ownership of the data. They, by default in the contract, agree to give it to researchers in publicly funded research organisations, and we're very clear about that. They agree to give it to the regulator because that's what gives them their value proposition, so they want it. But anything else they have to give permission to, and then we provide incentives in our pricing structure so that when they share their data, they can actually get a return on it. So we're committed to also working in an open innovation way and working with other businesses giving access to data, provided that the growers who are our customers are dealt in the upside. So the whole idea of this is to actually, how do we create a shared knowledge infrastructure and data markets and underpin this that can make Australia run faster? And there's certainly no one business is going to crack this problem. So really what we're doing is bringing together and creating, as an adjunct to this, is this whole issue of transparency, control and incentive to share for people like Sue, who is a grower and one of our customers. So this whole idea is actually underpinning the Food Agility Consortium, which we've formed here in Australia. And the business problem we're trying to solve with the Food Agility Consortium is that we are, again, at the top of the league tables in research, but at the bottom in terms of impact. And the problem that we have is that researchers spend 75% of their time trying to find data and go through research processes and then look around and say, hey, who wants this? We want to invert that on its head and effectively say, here, we can define the business problems, we will provide the data, we will provide the technology stack. Researchers, we want to work on that, and other innovators to create new models that we can then rapidly commercialise by dropping it back into our technology so that we have a commercialisation pathway before we've started. This is a really different way about thinking about how do we get impact, and I think one that has a lot of significance. We spend a lot of money, something like $9 billion in Australia in research, and we spend about $500 million in our Rural Development Corporation network, and we really need to focus about how do we get faster impact and how can we use digital technology to innovate the business model itself of research. So we have a whole consortium of companies that we're working together with in the Food Agility initiative. Some of them are listed here. So it covers universities, it covers technology partners, it covers the food industry at different levels, and it also covers government, who are really important players in this process. So we have put together as a cooperative research centre bid, which is in this round. Mike is the CEO leading the effort, taking the expertise of fintech and driving that into agriculture. We intend to really redefine how research and impact is done, and hope to push Australia to the top of the league table in terms of digital ag research. And the real opportunity here is to transform agriculture, but also make the digital exports of the future. So we'd love you to join us, and what we really want to do is create a field of flowers, just like the flower I showed you in the oyster example that the yield is involved in. And we believe that doing that sort of approach and coordinating our effort, that we really can transform Australian agriculture and digital agriculture and make us a world leader in this space. Thanks.